In the final stretch before Election Day, gubernatorial candidates Gavin Newsom and John Cox offered their visions of the California dream. San Diego Superior Court Judge KREEP is up for re-election, and he's gained more notoriety since his last time around, notably a censure from the State Judicial Board. And another caravan is heading towards the U.S. border from Honduras. Whatever became of the folks from the last caravan? Find out. I'm Ebony Monet, and KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Ebony Monet, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are columnists Michael Smullins from the San Diego Union Tribune, Maya Srikrishnan, immigration reporter for Voice of San Diego, Matthew Hall, editorial director at the Union Tribune, and KPBS reporter Amitha Sharma. A busy week in California politics with the general election now just less than 3 weeks away. We'll start with our discussion with the race for governor. Amitha, you sat down with candidates both Gavin Newsom and John Cox. Tell me a little bit about how their vision for California differs.
Well, they disagree on most of the major issues. On gun control, Gavin Newsom is in favor of tighter gun restrictions. John Cox is against them. Gavin Newsom is in favor of California being a sanctuary state. Vice versa. John Cox is against California being a sanctuary state. Gavin Newsom is in favor of that. Gavin Newsom is in favor of having California be a zero-emission state, and John Cox is against that. I spoke to them about the affordability crisis in California, which primarily centers around the high cost of housing. And Gavin Newsom says that it's his goal to get 3.5 million more homes built in California over the next decade. He says he's got a 15-point plan to get that done, and that includes creating conditions. He pointed out very quickly that it is not the state's job to build more housing, it's city's job to build more housing. But the way that the tax allocation system is set up right now, cities are incentivized to build these big box stores because they get more taxes from that. And what he said he wants to do is he wants to restructure that tax allocation. But separate and apart from that, he wants to create more housing zoning around transportation. He wants to boost tax credits for affordable housing. Those are just two of his ideas in his 15-point plan. John Cox likes to talk about the fact that he can build apartments in another state, primarily Indiana, for 1/5 the cost of what it takes to build an apartment complex in California. So he said what you need to do is you've got to cut the red tape. You've got to streamline the process, and you've got to end what he calls the frivolous lawsuits. And he says that once that happens, the cost of building more homes in California will go down, and thus the affordability crisis in this state will correct itself.
And you talk about Gavin Newsom's 15-point plan. Did John Cox lay out specifics to how he would cut the red tape?
No, he did not. He did not, but he laid out goals of what he wanted to see happen.
And Michael, with most registered voters here in California registered as Democrats, does a candidate like John Cox stand a chance?
I think I have a better chance of getting struck by lightning on a sunny day than he does becoming governor of California. But then again, you know, in the real politics, I don't think Republicans expect him to win. What they wanted was a credible candidate at the top of the ticket. They were really concerned that they would have two Democrats coming out of the primary, or kind of a far-out candidate, a far-right candidate. And, John Cox is conservative and has conservative views, but he's a businessman, a successful businessman. He presents a good image for them. So I think that helps. And also, as Amitha said, at least he brings forth, a real contrast to what the Democrats are talking about in terms of, philosophy of how to govern and get things done. So I think that's sort of the benefit of the race. Now, anything can happen, but it is sort of like a lightning strike situation, I think, for him to win at this stage.
And Cox is a big proponent of Prop 6, which is the efforts to repeal the gas tax increase. Why hasn't he been able to translate that into more support from voters? Because that's a popular sentiment.
It's a very good question, and I don't know that there's a clear answer to it. Republicans were certainly hoping that would help their candidates, people like John Cox. But I think we're finding that people separate things, that's not easily transferred. There's a lot of Democrats and independents and Republicans, of course, that support repealing the gas tax. Does that translate into blanket support for Republicans and their policies? Apparently not, because it doesn't seem to be showing up in the polls. What we don't know is, would John Cox be doing worse in the polls without that? It's a real boon to Republicans because he financed to put that on the ballot. And, it gives them something to help motivate voters for that. It's not a real hardcore partisan issue, which they've been losing on in California for years and years.
And it's very interesting, though, if you look at the two campaign commercials of Newsom and John Cox, Newsom is very sunny and very bright, very optimistic about California's future, but he does talk about the need to start early for programs with children in order to improve their opportunities in life. But it's John Cox who addresses voters head on, looks into the camera and talks about those bread and butter issues, having to choose between the cost of groceries and filling your tank with gas. And as someone who has been covering this issue of poverty over the past 10 months, those really are issues that voters are talking about, and somehow John Cox is not connecting with those voters despite the polls. Despite the fact that he's talking about what they care about.
I think it's the right message, but the wrong messenger. If you look at California, obviously Republicans not named Schwarzenegger don't do very well on a state level here. Also, if you look at the other gubernatorial candidates we've had in the recent past, Neil Kashkari, who could be chairman of the Fed one day, and Meg Whitman, who's an American business success story. He is neither of those.
And, he doesn't have any political experience. And you have Gavin Newsom, who was the former mayor of San Francisco. He's the current lieutenant governor. These are lieutenant governor isn't that high profile, but we at least know who he is. But as mayor of San Francisco, he got a lot of attention.
And Amita, can you tell us a little bit more about your California Dream project that you're working on, where you interviewed both Newsom and Cox?
So the California Dream project has taken a group of reporters, public media reporters from across the state, to look at what happened to the California Dream, where it is right now, and where it's headed. And
you talked to both Newsom and Cox regarding the California Dream and what that means to them and what they would do if elected to make it more attainable to more Californians. Let's hear a bit of what they had to say about that.
Can that dream be saved?
Absolutely. We just need the political leadership to change. The status quo in Sacramento is not working. We can see that in the numbers of people who are being pounded into poverty. Our school system is 47th in the nation now, near the bottom. We have got to make sure that we have the leadership, and it's all because of interest groups in Sacramento and the political class. There's got to be a change.
We're hardly perfect. We have these stubborn issues, poverty driven disproportionately by cost of living. You address the housing issue in a substantive, significant way, begin to address the growth framework of early interventions as it relates to poverty eradication. California's best days will not be behind it. They'll absolutely be in front of it.
And Amita, you talked about the voters that you're speaking to, saying that these issues about making the choices about what to buy, whether it be bread or housing, and those tough choices, which of the two candidates' messages do you think is resonating with voters right now?
Well, as I said, I think John Cox is addressing those issues, and I think Gavin Newsom is addressing them as well. The latest poll, I think by USC, Dorn Seif, and the LA Times, shows that Gavin Newsom has 54% of the vote among likely voters, and John Cox has 28%. So, as Michael was saying earlier, John Cox's message clearly isn't resonating with voters.
And this week, KPCC and KQED, they're reporting on alleged infidelity on the part of John Cox in his first marriage as presented in the divorce proceedings court documents. He in the past has been critical about other candidates, Vila Ragosa during the primary and Newsom, as well as their alleged misconduct during their marriage. Do you think, opening this up to the entire panel, do California voters care about this stuff?
I think that, voters anywhere make a distinction in this Me Too era between sexual harassment and assault and infidelity. I mean, we've had candidates at the national level and throughout. It's not pretty, but does that really change things in this? certainly, I'm sure the Newsom people are glad, okay, well, he's accusing us, now he has to explain that and so forth. But I just don't get the sense that people are as focused on that unless there's, like I said, a heinous accusation. I mean, Cox, I believe, said that, they were separated at the time and so forth. But I just wonder, given the history from the founding of the country, if you will, through, Clinton and Trump, people get elected regardless of that, it seems.
And switching gears, Michael, this week, Senator Dianne Feinstein, she actually shared the stage with State Senator Kevin De Leon for her first matchup with an opponent in about 18 years. With her polling ahead, why do you think she even agreed to this, I guess, informal debate?
Well, there was a lot of pressure on her to do it. I think also that she's in a comfortable position. It was a radio debate in the middle of the day. So, as far as the low wattage thing goes, what was the real interesting aspect of it was Senator De Leon, he's kind of thrown in the towel in a way. I mean, he was hardly critical of her, and I think he's looking to the future because he feels that he doesn't want to alienate a lot of Democrats by criticizing her harshly at this stage when she's so far ahead.
Now, turning now to the controversial re-election bid of San Diego Superior Court Judge Gary KREEP, who was censured by the State Commission on Judicial Performance and rated as lacking qualifications by the San Diego County Bar Association. Matt, you sit on the San Diego Union-Tribune editorial board, which interviewed both Judge KREEP and his opponent. Can you talk to me about what he had to say about his strategy to fight to keep his job?
Yeah, I mean, he has an uphill battle in the primary. He got 30% of the vote, and the handful of Democrats running KREEP as a Republican got 70%. So this is obviously a nonpartisan seat. It's a judgeship. But I think if you look back to his race in 2012, which he won with 50.04% of the vote, he wasn't elected in a landslide, and he's had some issues since then. So I think he does have an uphill battle. He comes across, it was interesting, in the editorial board interview, he came across as kind of thoughtful and, willing to discuss some of his baggage. But in the end, he's still a censured conspiracist, so we endorse Matt Brower, his opponent.
In speaking of some of his baggage, many of us first heard the name Gary KREEP when he helped to push the whole birther movement. He was actually pushing the idea, the false claim that President Obama was not born in the United States. And you talked to him about that. What did he have to say about his motivations behind that?
Yeah, this is one of those things where he explains it very rationally, very methodically. He says two things. One is that people asked him to look into it, and two, he thought it was the public's right to know whether this was true. We all know now what most of us assumed then, which is it's completely false. There was an interesting exchange where later in the discussion he talked about how he's not a conspiracy. He doesn't believe in conspiracies. And I said, well, there's a lot of people on the other side of the birther issue who might disagree with you. But again, he talks kind of thoughtfully. He talks as you would want to hear a judge talk. But then when you kind of listen to what he's saying, the birther issue alone should be disqualifying, and nearly was. But so we'll see what happens in 3 weeks.
How difficult is it in general for judges to not get reelected? Do you have any idea of how common or uncommon it is? I feel like a lot of people aren't engaged in judicial races.
That's a good point. Most people don't pay much attention to them. A lot of people leave those blank, right? As a voter, you're allowed to. There were 22 judges challenged up and down the state. 2 here in San Diego County, and he's the only one who's in a runoff. So that tells you right there how rare it is. Usually judges get appointed by the governor, and these are jobs that they can have for life. Every 6 years they have to stand for re-election, and most people don't challenge them because it is such a fight on their hands. But I think with KREEP's baggage, he had several people wanting to take his
So was he
his
endorsed by his supervisory judge or not?
Well, apparently there are 2 supervisory judges. His current supervisory judge does endorse him. His prior supervisory judge, who apparently was a supervisory judge for most of his term, is endorsing Matt Brower.
Matt, the birther issue takes so much attention on KREEP, Judge KREEP, but is the fact that the Judicial Council said he's a bad judge, I mean, is that really what's going to drive this? Because the birther issue was out there before. Yeah. When he first ran, there was no notion of what kind of judge he'd be, and he got censured pretty heavily.
Yeah, that's a good point. The California Commission on Judicial Performance sanctioned him so seriously that there's only one other sanction more seriously than his censure, which is getting kicked off the bench. 4 of the 14 judges who kind of stood in judgment of him actually suggested that he be thrown off the bench. And you know, we had a long discussion with him about some of these points. He got censured for a wide range of misconduct, from some campaign violations to you know, asking one prostitute in his courtroom if she was in it for the money or the action. Now, we can all agree that that's terrible. He admits that he did that, and he has this kind of long-winded explanation of how he was trying to help her get to a better place in life. But judicial temperament is a big reason why people choose judges, and that, you know, again, if it's not disqualifying, it's pretty close to it.
And judicial temperament has been in the news a lot lately
as
with
we know.
Judge Gavin.
Yeah, as we know.
And Matt, he has an explanation, Judge KREEP does, about what he calls a target on his back, and he says he's had that target ever since he was first elected. Can you talk a little bit about his explanation for why he may be on the outs?
Yeah, I mean, I think when he ran the first time, he says that the establishment lined up against him. He says that journalists tried to take him out. You know, and so I think he feels like the system is set up against him. In our interview, which you can find sdut.us/2018 endorsements, shameless plug, he talked a bit about this process and how he almost like sees himself as someone who's standing up to people in power and trying to do good in his courtroom and in his campaign. And the question for voters is that the case, or is he full of it?
And let's hear from him in his own words from the interview with the panel.
But what happened is because I stood up to the judicial, legal, et cetera, establishment, a lot of people took it very hard. And as I was told by one of the senior judges, shortly after I took the bench, I had a target on my back. And so then came the CJP inquiry, and $250,000 was spent by my opponents in the primary election to try to knock me out.
And quickly, can we talk a bit about the district attorney who's challenging him?
Sure, yeah. Matt Brower has a pretty impressive background. Even if he was running against a stronger candidate, you know, he would get a lot of attention. He's a judge advocate in the Marine Corps, and he's a deputy district attorney in the DA's office. He is only 40 years old, which I think some people look at as a negative because you kind of want a judge to have been around a long time. Judge KREEP, before he became a judge, was a lawyer for 37 years. But given his age and the fact that might cut against him, his background, I think, and his temperament has caused a lot of people on the right and the left to kind of line up behind him.
And shifting gears, an update now on the hundreds of migrants, most from Honduras, who have band together, heading towards Mexico and the United States. Maya, you covered a caravan that arrived in Tijuana, I believe in April. If that case was any indication of what these migrants might experience, what do they have ahead of them?
Well, so the caravan that arrived here in the spring, it started out with about 1,500 people, similar to this caravan. And along the journey, you know, some people decided to stay in Mexico. And I think maybe over 300, around 350, actually got to Tijuana, and probably only around 200 ended up requesting asylum in the U.S. or trying to enter otherwise. So I think that a lot of people make the decision along the way of whether getting all the way to the U.S. is what is best for them, or if it's easier to just stay in various places in Mexico. But right now, this caravan seems to be facing a struggle at the Mexican border that it seems more intense than what the caravan from the spring faced.
And why travel in such great numbers versus maybe a smaller group that would be less detected? What's the perceived benefit from traveling in this large group? Well,
there are two benefits. The first, so the journey up to the U.S.-Mexico border is very dangerous, and migrants, they typically don't have a lot of money, and if they're traveling alone, they're really vulnerable to being extorted, raped, kidnapped, and dealing with a lot of other things. And so there's one, that there's safety in numbers, and the second is that migrants have been making this journey for a long time, and especially with a lot of the rhetoric coming from the U.S. about why they're coming, what they're doing, it's also a way for them to kind of have a collective voice to draw more attention to why they're making the journey.
And this caravan has certainly gotten the attention of President Trump, just like the first caravan, earlier caravan, did as well. President Trump has been tweeting about it. He's been lately this week blaming the Democrats, and he's also been threatening to shut down the border. And Maya, I know recently you caught up with some of the folks from the initial caravan. Can you tell us, I know that they're scattered in different locations, but can you kind of give us an overall snapshot of what they're experiencing now?
Yeah, so some of them have decided to stay in Mexico in various parts. The ones who have come into the U.S., they've had different fates depending on how they chose to come into the U.S. and various other things. So those who turned themselves in at the port of entry and requested asylum, some of them are still in detention centers. Some of them have been able to be released on bond, and so they're kind of in various cities around the U.S., either where they have family or where they've been able to find sponsors, and they're awaiting their case to go forward. People in detention are also awaiting their case to go forward, but they have not been able to be released from detention at this point. And then there are people who may have crossed in places other than ports of entry, and so they were prosecuted under zero tolerance. Not all of them, but the government tried to prosecute a lot of them, and that's where we saw a lot of the family separations. So those people went through the criminal system, and then they were either deported or they are going through the immigration system now.
And you reported on kind of what sounded, based upon reading your reports, like chaos in the court system, just kind of being overrun with cases. Have things calmed down a bit?
So I think that there's still a push and pull of how to deal with all of these cases. It's a big number of misdemeanor cases that the federal court system in San Diego hasn't dealt with before, and defense attorneys are pushing back really, really hard against a lot of the practices. So I think that it's something that's still adjusting. It's not chaotic in the same way, but there's always a new burden or a new thing that's kind of being thrown in every couple of months.
And speaking of a new burden, for the migrants that stayed in Tijuana, there have been some complaints about police abuse with the police. What's happening? What are you hearing?
So from the migrants who stayed from the caravan in Tijuana, they have been organizing in the past couple of months because there was an arrest of 2 organizers that they felt was unjust and overly abusive. And so, to them, they say that this is something that is really common in Tijuana, that they're constantly targeted to be extorted, they're often abused, and there's a lot of maltreatment. And so they are trying to kind of organize protests and things like that to draw attention to the issue and bring around some change.
So with a group of people, they're fleeing poverty, they're fleeing violence, they're displaced. You're also reporting about this new sense of empowerment, which surprised me a bit. Can you talk to me about that and even this song that's come about at the vigils, kind of encouraging the people there?
Well, that's one of the things that I had mentioned before about the collective power of the caravan, is that, they're in feeling that they're not in this alone, and in feeling that they're safer and more empowered in numbers. They are speaking out about their experiences more than they used to, and they have outlets to do so. And I think some of the organizers with the caravan from the spring, they have been doing a lot of leadership workshops and things like that to educate that group of people. And so they've been organizing in various ways, whether it be, in detention centers or once they're out, or even in Tijuana.
And can we hear a bit from the song that's being used at some of these vigils to encourage and inspire? It's Caravana Migrante 2018. That's what I saw. In opening up this last question to the panel, do you think that this caravan of migrants and how this all plays out, if and when they arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border and how they're treated at that point, how do you think that will impact the general election, which is less than 3 weeks away?
Well, I think that we expected Trump, as he has, gone back to immigration. That's the well he always dips into. It's a legitimate issue, and a lot of people are concerned about it. Does this bring more focus to it? I think so, but I don't know that it heightens it that much, because this was going to be something that he would be pushing throughout. But interestingly, he's doing a lot of stuff at these rallies, but hasn't, he doesn't have the build the wall mantra, so it's a little more of a scattered approach, I think, from Trump. But I don't see a lot of Republicans in swing districts really making a hardcore case on it. Obviously, they want stronger immigration enforcement, but going too far in some people's minds, I think the Republicans feel that might hurt them.
Maya?
Oh, you're good.
You can talk.
Oh.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, one of the things that he campaigned on before was it really tapped into a lot of xenophobia, and I think that the timing of this caravan, he's trying to do it again, and it seems kind of clear with the tweets.
Well, that wraps up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. Thank you to Michael Smullins from the San Diego Union Tribune, Maya Srikrishnan from Voice of San Diego, Matthew Hall with the Union Tribune, and Amita Sharma with KPBS News. Thanks for joining me. A reminder, a lot of the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Ebony Monet. Thanks for joining us.